All right, welcome. And now it's on to Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, Chapters 1 to 3 in this video. So we've seen Aristotle in a number of previous videos. He's laid out basically the plan of the Nicomachean Ethics. He's talked about the main goal of it is to figure out what that term eudaimonia means. He's canvassed a bunch of views, and he's come up with some definitions, some starting points, arche of ethics. And if that's unfamiliar to you, go back and check those videos out. So what he's doing now in Book 3 is he's looking at notions of voluntary, involuntary, choices, decisions, deliberations. All important aspects of ethics. So Chapter 1 of Book 3, Aristotle lays out a number of very important terms. And this is a very thick and rich and interesting discussion. There's lots of reflections on human behavior. This little chapter, only a couple pages long, is well worth plenty of study. It's quite rewarding. I'm just going to give you kind of the highlights of it. And Aristotle starts off by saying something quite important, that character virtues, remember we're talking about ethos arete, the character virtues, we're not talking about virtues in general, distinctly human virtues, the ones especially that as an activity of soul that indirectly listens to reason, and those are the character virtues. So they are concerned with the emotions, actions, and passions, whereas the intellectual virtues, we'll look a little bit more at them later, they are actually quite different. They don't deal with emotions. The character virtues, remember, deal with a mean. Intellectual ones do not. Again, if that's all unfamiliar, go back, have a look at those videos. So the character virtues deal with actions, emotions. But we only praise and blame people for voluntary actions. So we don't blame and praise people for all of them. You know, simple things like, I praise you if you knew what you were doing when you did it. I don't tend to praise, I wouldn't tend to praise you if you did something and you didn't know what you were doing, you were acting out of ignorance or whatnot. So Aristotle recognizes that there's an important connection between voluntary actions, praise, blame, etc., and the whole notion of character virtue. So he says it's a good idea to get a little clearer on this. So what that is, to get clearer on the distinction between the voluntary and the involuntary. And in this chapter, he's going to offer a number of reflections, as I said, but it's primarily centered around the involuntary. All right, so but again, this is a little bit tricky because some of the distinctions are not entirely clear. You shouldn't think of them as watertight. These I'd like to regard as a spectrum of categories that sort of illustrates how complex human behavior can be. Now, there's different ways to organize Aristotle's discussion. I'm offering one, and it's not a perfect organization. As I said, you can do it in different ways. And I'm not even capturing all of Aristotle's discussion. As I said, this is a very thick and rich chapter. So a couple of terms here, as we can think of human actions and we'll look at emotions later. We're now just talking about actions. So we have three main divisions here. One is the akousion, which is the voluntary, akousion, the involuntary, and then Aristotle later on introduces another term, which which is not, so the non, so the non-voluntary. So he's got three sort of largish categories, and how do we classify actions according to them? Well, this one, the voluntary, you can think of them as actions with the will, or willed actions, ones that you do with knowledge, and you say, yeah, I wanted to do that, or I intended to do that, and I was clear about what was going on. So there's an element of knowledge here, that the agent is aware of what's going on. So there's awareness, and that's what I'm trying to capture with the expression, with the will, right? So it was clear and with knowledge. The involuntary, of course, is going to be against. In this case, it's going to be against the will. The agent is not really, shall we say, the author of the action. Something external is. But the agent does the action. So you might be saying, well, how does that work? Well, Aristotle gives some simple examples. And like if, for instance, if a wind pushes you and you didn't want to be moved by it, right? It pushed you against your will. So you actually did the movement, but it wasn't something that you wanted to do. Think about, we make these kinds of distinctions, and they're quite important with ethics. So actions that are voluntary and involuntary are extremely important in ethics. And a simple example, let's say you're sitting on a bus, and I walk by you, and I have a knapsack on or something, and I walk by you, and I happen to hit you in the head as you're sitting there with my knapsack. And you say, oh, that hurt. And I say, oh, sorry, the bus lurched or moved, and then I accidentally hit you with my knapsack. I didn't intend to do that, and I certainly wouldn't want to do that. That was, against my will. The bus moved and went against my will, but I actually ended up hitting you with the knapsack. And think of how you would feel if that were the case, or if I said to you, oh yeah, that's what I wanted to do. I meant to hit you. It has nothing to do with the bus. So externally, those two actions could be indistinguishable, but we would look to the internals of them as very important, and we would make big ethical judgments, right? If I said to you, I didn't mean to do it, it was against my will, you would say, oh, okay, well, I don't blame you then, no problems. Etc., etc. But if I said I meant to do it, you would blame and you'd get upset and you'd say, hey, that was wrong that you did that. So we do, to use more modern terminology, we would make a difference between a causal action, right? One where the bus just caused me to bump you, and one where I caused it, where I initiated the action and hit you. So think about, causes as being outside in one sense, where we wouldn't blame the agent as the bus moves and I bump you, or cause as being in the agent when I decide that I want to bump you with the knapsack. And we make very different judgments according to the location of what we think, or the location of where we think the cause originates. All right. So in that sense, we've got two main categories, but it gets, as not surprisingly, as I said, this is a fairly rich and in-depth discussion of involuntary. So that's what Aristotle is more interested here in this chapter. He's going to look more later on in chapters 2 and 3 about the voluntary, because that's really where the important stuff is about ethics. Remember, when it's involuntary, as I bump you because of the bus lurching, it's not really an ethical issue. We sort of agree on that. But if I say I intended to bump you, it was with my will, then we're talking ethics and making judgments of praise and blame. So this chapter is primarily, it introduces the voluntary, but it really is concentrating on the notion of the involuntary and the non-voluntary. Now, how do those relate? Well, it's a complex relationship, but I've got a little diagram that might help things out. So let's have a look at this. I talked about how the voluntaries with the will, that's for later on. We're now looking at the involuntary and the non-voluntary. The non-voluntary, as we can see, is represented by the large circle, is a very broad category. So lots of actions that we have are non-voluntary. The involuntary is, so involuntary actions are against the will. So if it's against the will, it will be, without the will. So the non-voluntary is without the will. So there's two ways it can be without the will, like purely without the will, or without the will as against it. So non-voluntary in the large sense is with just simply independent of the will. A more specific is the involuntary, which is against the will. Aristotle has now a notion of ignorant actions. And what you've got here in the sphere of ignorant actions, they're all non-voluntary, but they can actually slide into being more specifically involuntary when you introduce a temporal dimension, the notion of regret. Okay, so there's sort of a rough outline. Let's flesh in a few details. So the non-voluntary, these are, in a sense, without the will, but we have to be a little bit clearer about that, because Aristotle really says that we kind of have actions that are partly sort of under the will and partly not. Remember when I said earlier that these categories are not watertight. Aristotle, and we'll talk in a minute, he even thinks there are things like mixed actions. So human behavior is complex and doesn't lend itself, not surprisingly, to mathematical precision. We're not doing math here, Aristotle says. We're doing ethics, and there's nothing wrong with ethics. It's just a different discipline than mathematics. So it's not going to have the same level of rigor and precision. And there's no problem with that. That's not a fault. That's just the way things are. And we as good ethicists, we as good thinkers and pursuers of eudaimonia, we recognize that fact that the methodology can have only as much rigor as the domain itself allows. Remember that first principle of inquiry according to Aristotle. All right, so let's look a little bit more. So the non-voluntary, these are without the will. And that can be understood kind of like as partly with and partly against and partly without. So it's a bit more complex. So in one sense, the agent is really taking action in the non-voluntary with a kind of partial knowledge. So there's ignorance involved with it. And it's easier to understand it a little bit in a little bit more of a concrete sense than to do it in the abstract one. I put this up just for organization. But think of it this way. Aristotle is interested when you consider actions that are done out of ignorance. What happens when the subject that does the action out of ignorance is informed of the more complete situation? That, after the information comes in, that will change the action in terms of, it will still be an ignorant action, but it might slide over into the ignorant involuntary, or it might stay in just a purely ignorant action altogether. So let's look at how things are affected by the resolution. Let's say, for example, and I'm going to just give another example that certainly Aristotle couldn't have. Let's say I sell you a car without giving you all the information. Something like that, or any product, it doesn't really matter. And so I talk to you about the car, and I don't lie to you about anything. I tell you about the car, but I just say I don't give you complete information about the car. Then I say, okay, well, do you want to buy it? And I say, I'll just try and stack the deck here. I say, it's up to you. If you want to buy it, go ahead. If you don't, whatever. But I've given you my little sales pitch. What do you think? And then let's say, walk away or whatever. And then you come later and you say, yeah, I'd like to buy the car. Well, in that sense, when you're making the statement, yes, I'd like to buy the car, you're signing on the dotted line, you're handing over the cash or whatever, it's more or less it seems to be that it's voluntary in a sense, right? But let's say later on, afterwards, you get more information about the car. Well, you say, hey, if I had known all that, I wouldn't have bought the car. So in one sense, you can say I was acting out of ignorance, right? So it was an ignorant action. And in that sense, it really was non-voluntary, and I regret doing it. So it would slide from just ignorant, non-voluntary ignorant, it would be, that really was against my will. Why? Because if you'd have told me all that stuff, I wouldn't have bought the car. So had I been more informed, less ignorant about things, I would not have bought the car. So, in other words, had I have known, I would have done things differently. So and then if I have somehow still been made to purchase the car with that knowledge, that clearly would have been totally against the will. So that would have been in the involuntary against the will camp. So, but on the other hand, it could also be that I've done something ignorant. I don't know. It could be something like, let's say a person says something, nasty towards another person. Okay, so there's an action, and they're not really thinking about it, not really contemplating anything, but they're just saying it. And then afterwards you say, hey, you know what, you said you made that comment to that person, and that really upset him, right? That was really nasty. Now let's say the originator of the statement looked at you and said something like this. Oh, well, when I made the statement, I wasn't aware that it was a nasty comment. But now that you put it that way, that it was a terrible comment, I really don't care, right? I was in ignorance when I made it. I don't regret it, So because I'm allowing the possibility, the speaker is allowing the possibility that, hey, even if I had have known that was a lousy thing to say, I'd have still said it. So it's not involuntary. But when it was said, it wasn't with the will. It was more or less just without the will. But no, it didn't go against the will. So that's the little subtlety here of without the will isn't necessarily against the will. So in that sense, this person says, I don't regret doing that. Now that I know the full detail, yeah, I acted in ignorance, and now that I have knowledge, I still don't care. So I didn't care then, and because I was unaware, but I don't. Now I'm aware, and I still don't care. So that would be an act as non-voluntary, but not involuntary. So you got to think about Aristotle's analysis as involving a temporal dimension when he talks about this. So Aristotle clearly is talking about human actions on, shall we say, a spectrum. So it gets quite complicated. Aristotle also in this chapter talks about mixed actions. And mixed actions are, again, when we seem to have partly with the will, partly against the will. And let's look at a specific type of an example. Aristotle uses one, namely of a captain of a ship, and imagine you're the captain of a ship. There's a nasty storm, and you have to make a decision. On the ship, you have two items. Well, one item, namely cargo, and you have passengers. All right, so you're the captain of the ship with cargo and passengers, and you get a storm thrown at you. Well, under normal circumstances, when you're the captain, you don't throw cargo overboard, and you certainly don't throw passengers overboard. But when you have a storm, this is an external, shall we say, an external cause. You have a situation forced upon you that you have to make a judgment. And in that sense, you may have to, let's say, with the storm, you do some evaluating and you say, okay, because of the storm, I have an external cause. In other words, now I'm faced with a risk. Well, if the storm is tossing the boat a lot and I've got all this cargo and all these passengers, I may have too much weight. I'm taking on some water. I'm going to have too much weight. I risk capsizing. Anyways, I have a variety of risks. I don't know a lot about what it's like to be a captain, but you'd have to make judgments, all kinds of judgments involving risk. So you say something like this. Well, all things considered, given this external cause, I decide to take action, namely, the action will be to jettison the cargo. So you offer to dump the cargo. Now, that is, in a sense, against your will as a captain. You would never want to do this. You're fully aware of you're doing something, and you're like, I don't want to do this. This is something that I'm totally against. And under normal circumstances, otherwise unqualified, as Aristotle says, I would never dump cargo as a captain. I mean, that's my bread and butter, or I'm under a contract to deliver cargo, and I'm not going to dump passengers. So I make a decision to dump the cargo. And as Aristotle says, well, we do ask people after they do these kinds of things. We ask them, okay, well, why did you do that? Can you defend why you did that? How did you evaluate the risk, right? So there's evaluation here. And we do hold people responsible for, let's say, someone might say, well, it wasn't really that bad of a storm. You didn't have to dump all the cargo, or maybe you should have dumped more cargo. So we do hold people responsible, at least partly in this way, but we also recognize that there is an external cause to the situation. So this is an example of a mixed action, and we would say in some cases, sure, we can accept that you did something against your will, and maybe we even praise it. So maybe we would say, well, despite the fact that we don't like cargo being dumped, we will still praise you for doing that because you save passengers. So Aristotle says these are mixed actions where there's external and internal aspects to the situation when people are taking actions. And he lists a variety of situations. But he does think that all things considered, though, there are limits to this because he gives examples of yes, we would also condone certain kinds of mixed actions. Let's say if you were something in the case, like standard sort of moral examples, like if you say, yes, I broke the law, Your Honor, you're in court, I broke the law, I did something that was wrong, I knew exactly what I was doing, but I stole that piece of bread, say, because my child was hungry or starving, and I did it. So in that sense, we might condone it, Aristotle says, under certain things, like if a tyrant captures your parents, to use Aristotle's example, and then wants you to do something that's maybe, untoward, or you do it. We would condone it. But Aristotle even says, even in those circumstances, and he uses examples of Greek plays where he thinks some of them are ridiculous when people are threatened by tyrants or gods or mysterious forces, and then they do all kinds of terrible things. So Aristotle would say, here in this realm, there are limitations as to what we would condone. So we have to all use our judgment in these, even in the cases of mixed actions. So there's a number of discussions he's got. So sometimes we praise, sometimes we blame, condone, etc., etc. So there's limits. We don't just condone anything or everything because of hard circumstances. We might say something like, oh, well, we might condone something like you snuck into the bakery and stole a loaf of bread to feed your child, but we wouldn't probably condone something like, well, you killed everybody in the bakery to get that loaf of bread. No, that's way over the top. So we would make judgments on these, and again, that shows that the individual example, as Aristotle always says in ethics, has to be considered on its own merits. You don't just have a blanket law of saying, oh, well, if you do something like this, we'll condone it. No, we look at all the circumstances that are involved. Now, as I said, once again, you can see there's a lot going on in this chapter, and this chapter is primarily concerning actions that we don't really want to do or we're not comfortable with doing, and Aristotle goes into a lot more detail here with respect to ignorant actions, and he talks about how some actions are done because of ignorance, like where a general sort of lack of knowledge, and sometimes they're done through ignorance, or sorry, in ignorance. So he makes that distinction of because of, through, and in. So he talks about if you're acting in ignorance, it might be because of drunkenness or bad character or whatnot. So he goes into a lot more detail and some very interesting psychological reflections. And of course, psychology used to be a branch of philosophy. But that's not really going to concern us, because the main place of action, shall we say, the main interest in ethics, as I said at the very beginning, is not with the actions that are committed against the will or without the will. The main thing is those that are with the will. This is really the domain of ethics, right? Sure, there are some cases where we'll make ethical judgments here, but primarily we're looking at, this is the main domain of ethics, when we're talking about what we do when we've got our will aligned and we're intending and willing to do something. All right, so in chapter 2, that's exactly what he's going to pick up on, is when we start looking at the voluntary. So in chapter 2, we're looking at Aristotle's notion of the voluntary. But of course, Aristotle, being the good philosopher that he is, and a very analytic mind, he wants to say that this is a large category. As a matter of fact, it's a very large category, even broader than the category really that we need for doing ethics. So far, I just talked about the voluntary in the broad sense with the will in the domain of ethics. But I want to be a little bit more precise about this now, because something with the will may not be exactly something that is appropriate for ethics. So the voluntary, Aristotle says, is a broad category. What he's interested primarily, if you recall from our discussions of autorité and his definition of autorité, it involved rational choice. So if you're not familiar with the definition of autorité, go back and watch the video on that. But choice is very important. It's choosing, to try and hit a mean that's relevant or relative to us, not a mathematical mean, but it involves a rational choice. So in this sense, now we've got to look at choice. And according to Aristotle, choice is a smaller, or we could say a species of the voluntary. You can think of it this way. Choices are voluntary acts, but not all voluntary acts are choices. So if that throws you a little bit, think of it this way. So, if you're making choices, and we should also include the notion that we're talking about rational choice. So, we'll put a little R here for rational choice. So, when you're making rational choices, those are voluntary actions. But you can have actions, let's say out here, that are not choices. So, what would that look like? Well, first off, Aristotle says that choice is even more a sign of your character than actions are. The choices that we make are extremely important. So in one sense, it certainly wasn't the existentialists that said that our characters are determined by choices. Aristotle was aware of this as well. And he said, choice, you look at a person's choices rather than their actions, that will tell you a lot about their character. It's even more of a sign of character than actions are. Now, children and animals are outside of choices. So the domain, children and animals. Not surprising that children and animals are in the domain of voluntary actions because they often act according to their own impulses, but they don't really make choices. Again, that fits in, as we've seen earlier, with Aristotle saying that children and animals, they can have pleasures and all that, but not eudaimonia. So eudaimonia is going to be connected up with choices, and children and animals are really outside of that. So, but they have voluntary actions. So just because they don't make choices, like rational choices, doesn't mean they're, always pushed around by external forces. No, you have voluntary actions. So the voluntary, as Aristotle says, is broader than choices. Now, what's choice? Well, he says that choice is not, he starts off by a negative root. He says that choice is not desire, passion, not desire, not passion, not wish, or belief. So, choice is not desire, passion, so not desire, passions, or wish. Oops. It's not any of these. It's not desire, passion, wish, or belief. So what exactly is it? Well, he says choice is similar. Choice is similar to wish. Right? You can, and you think about wishing. What are we doing when we wish for things? When you make up a wish list, it seems to be connected to something like hope. I wish that millions of people would watch this video, but I can't choose that. Right? That seems rather intuitively clear. What's going on? What's the difference? Well, when you wish, there is kind of an element of hope that's involved. That's not really the same with choice. You might say afterwards, I hope I made the right choice, but it's not, that's an attitude post facto about the choice itself. That's not really built into the choice. But wishes have hopes involved. Also, wishes can deal with anything. I wish that I could fly, right? Not get in an airplane. I wish I could flap my arms, or I wish I could, be a great sprinter, or I wish that I could, jump buildings with a single leap, or things like that. So wishes can deal with all kinds of things. They involve hope, and a wish, and wishes can also involve the impossible. Right? So it's actually a much broader category. It seems to have some connections with choices, but you can't choose impossibilities, right? You can hope for them, you can wish for them, but you can't choose them. So we wish for eudaimonia, Aristotle says. So wish we wish for eudaimonia. All right. So we wish for eudaimonia. There we go. Eudaimonia, we wish for that, but we choose to put the things in place that will lead to eudaimonia. So that's another important distinction. Wishes can be about impossible things. Wishes are mixed up with hope. Wishes are also about, and remember what eudaimonia is. Eudaimonia is the ultimate end, the goal, the complete, that which gives life its meaning and makes it worth living. That's which is connected with being in a blessed state, according to Aristotle. So this is an end. And how does choice play a role in here? Well, ends are arrived at through means. So what are the means? Well, the means are the things that we choose. All right. So choices are related to wishes in a sense as means are related to ends. All right. So what's really going on here is that wishes are us just blue skying things. Right? I wish for, and you just go ahead, go crazy. Think about anything you want. But choices really involve things that are under our power, things that make sense that we can do. I can't choose to flap my arms and fly away, but it makes sense that I can choose to walk out of the room and stop this video right now. but I can't choose to just sort of leap out of the room and fly off into the sky. So maybe I wish that I could do that if the video is going badly. So in that sense, wishes and choices are somewhat related, but clearly the notion of wish has a much, much broader spectrum than the notion of choice. So always read Aristotle with an idea that he's doing a lot of conceptual analysis. As we saw, go back and look at the video that deals with Book 1, Chapter 6, on his criticisms of the Platonic notion of the good. And he goes through all those categories, and he does a lot of linguistic analysis. Aristotle is constantly concerned with how we talk and get our concepts right. Get the right kinds of concepts and analysis, and you're going to be much better off. So again, Aristotle is not always just concerned with what's out there, but how we conceptualize what's out there. That's extremely important, and that's the whole point of a discipline. A discipline is to have the right set of categories in place to do your analysis. Get the wrong set of categories, and your analysis is going to go astray all the time. All right, so choice is also very different, not just only from, well, Aristotle says it's clearly different than pleasures, but it's also, as I said, different from wish, but it's also different from belief. Right? And how is choice different from belief? Well, it may strike us as obvious now, but Aristotle says, well, choices are about like what's good and bad, like what's good and bad for us. Beliefs, he says, are really about what's true and false. And so in order to unpack this, a belief is really about states of affairs in the world and whether or not our beliefs conform to them. And that's not exactly the clearest way, but think of it as beliefs are concerned with what's true and false, whereas choices are concerned with what's good. All right? So what's good in order to get us to the end of eudaimonia. So choice is different. It's from all of these. It's a part of the voluntary, but again, the voluntary is a much broader category than the notion of choice. Choice now. Okay, I've stressed that choice is part of the voluntary, but it's not the way that animals and children have it, because the voluntary can be, for them, just like an impulse or something, but the impulse is internal. So it's not an external impulse like the wind shoving you, as I talked about here, where that would be an example of the, at least the non-voluntary, and probably most likely the involuntary. But in this sense, Aristotle says choice is not something arbitrary. Choice, remember the little r here, choice involves rationality, involves reason. So it's not an arbitrary action of ours, even if it's voluntary. You can have the arbitrary voluntary actions over here, but that's where choices are in this little drawing here of that which is reasonable. So now, this sets up the next stage. Choice is going to be linked up with reason. And remember, for Aristotle, character virtue involves, trying to hit a mean, and that involves choosing that mean and choosing it with respect to us, not a mathematical mean. So it is a notion of reasoning. So the question is how is choice linked to reasoning? Choice involves things that are under our power, and they're things that the things that are under our power, we have to do some reasoning about them. So now what Aristotle is going to say in chapter 3, which I'll move to, is that choice is going to be kind of like a product. And what's it a product of? Well, he's going to turn and talk about deliberation. So I'm going to move now to chapter 3 and talk about deliberation. So chapter 3 is really about deliberation and decision. Deliberation and decision. We deliberate, Aristotle says, about things that are within our power. Not surprisingly, because we're talking about choice here, and remember, choice is different than wish, it's different than belief. Choice is about things that are under our power. That's what we deliberate about what we can do. So deliberation is about what we can do, what we can do, what we can bring about. So the things that we can bring into, shall we say, into existence. But they're not just regular sort of things that we bring into existence. You wouldn't deliberate, Aristotle says, about something like making a chair. That's really a process that always works and produces the same result. You don't deliberate about a process that basically is stable and fixed. Right? As you think about the old expression of doing the exact same thing over and over again, and expecting a different result is kind of like a sign of madness. Well, Aristotle is picking up on that by saying, look, if some sort of pattern or procedure leads to the same thing all the time, you're not deliberating about that. Right? Because it always brings about the same results. What do you deliberate about? What kind of process? Well, Aristotle uses the example of let's say trying to make some money, right? That's a process. You can get pretty good at that. But every time you do it, it's going to bring about slightly different amounts of money. There will be other things that get involved. So you would be deliberating about that process. It's under your power, but it's not something that's completely controllable. So that's another way to think of it. It's about what we can do, what we can bring about, and has an element of, shall we say, variability in it. So if it's strict and clean and always gives the same result, you wouldn't deliberate about it. Just like you don't deliberate and wonder about things in mathematics. You may investigate them, but you don't deliberate about them. So deliberation is a kind of investigation, like mathematics, but it's different than mathematics. And we've seen plenty of examples of that. So we deliberate when the consequences, right? We deliberate when consequences of actions are unclear. So that's the variability thing that I've mentioned. In many of those situations, Aristotle said, when things are really important and the consequences are unclear, we get others to come in. We may pay someone to deliberate for us. Oh, well, you're really good at that. I'd like you to have a look into this for me. Or instead of looking into it for me, I'd like you to look and deliberate with me. So that's how we get together and deliberate in groups and in communities to try and get the best result, different kinds of perspectives, and different ways of trying to handle the variability, namely where the consequences of actions are unclear. Now, as we saw, choice deals with means, not ends, wishes and all that stuff. That deals with ends. So it's not surprisingly that deliberation, which is linked to choice, is also about means to ends. We deliberate really over when consequences are unclear, but deliberation is really over the means it's the means to the consequences, right? Those are like your ends that are desired or wished or hoped for or whatnot. So we deliberate over the means. In other words, what the deliberation really is, what's the best? What's the best set of means that will get us to the ends that we want? So deliberation is a particular kind of investigation, as mathematics is an investigation, but mathematics is a different kind. So deliberation is an investigation or inquiry into what it is within our power to bring about in variable circumstances. Okay, so that sets up the main outline of this chapter. Stay tuned. We'll dig in further in the next video.